Hello, AP World and A Push students. This is Mr. Chapman here. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking to you about the document-based question, or for short, we call it the DBQ. If you took AP World last year with either me or Mrs. Cespedes, or if you took it at another school, you should already know how to do the DBQ. But please don't put me in a box. There's still a lot you can learn, and a lot of you are at various stages in your development as far as writing this. So there's still plenty of new information that you can learn so that you can improve. If you took honors last year, you might have done some DBQs, but they're a little bit different than the College Board AP World, A Push, and AP Euro DBQs. If you took the AP exam last year for AP World, they modified the rubric due to the COVID crisis, and we now are back to the 7-point rubric. So we're not using the 10-point rubric. We are using the 7-point rubric that you learned throughout all of last year. Okay, if you can see the rubric in front of me, every DBQ, and this is actually the same for the LEQ, your first paragraph for both of these essays will be comprised of what we call contextualization and a thesis statement. You'll write the first 3 to 4 sentences will be contextualization, and then the final 1 to 2 sentences of that first paragraph will be your thesis statement. Let's talk for a minute about contextualization. Contextualization is not causation necessarily. So let's take an example that would apply to both courses. The A-Push students right now, you guys are working on the American Revolution. In AP World, we will touch on that, not to the detail that they will in A-Push, but we'll look at it in a larger picture with the French Revolution, Latin American revolutions, and the slave revolt in Haiti. Okay, the American Revolution. Causes of the American Revolution would include things like no taxation without representation, the Boston Tea Party, the Townsend Acts. These would all be causes. Contextualization is broader in scope. And so if you look at American history, you will realize that in the decades leading up to some of these causes, which I just listed, there had been a policy by the British Crown that more or less allowed the colonists to govern their own affairs. This policy is often referred to by historians as salutary neglect or benign neglect. In other words, the British Empire was quite busy trying to increase its holdings globally, that they more or less left their colonists in North America to manage their own affairs. So then when the British started to tighten the reins, so to speak, when they felt like the colonists were getting a little bit too, shall we say, mouthy and independent, they started enacting all of these oppressive measures. To the colonists' point, they were oppressive. To the British point of view, it was in keeping with what a colonial power did. In any event, this policy of salutary neglect would contextualize the revolution, whereas the causes would be the Boston Tea Party. Okay, so that's the difference between contextualization and causation. So you would write, if you had an essay that was dealing with causes of the American Revolution, your contextualization would include a few sentences describing salutary neglect, and then you could list out a variety of causes in your thesis statement. Okay, so let's talk about the thesis statement for a minute. A thesis is also an argument. Some people write a statement and think it's a thesis statement. If there's no argument, if there's no assertion, then it can't be a thesis. It's just a statement. So you have to actually answer the prompt involved. Okay. So if you had a document-based question that said, using the documents, analyze similarities in the American Revolution and the French Revolution, you would have to actually list specific similarities in order for that thesis statement to be valid. Now you'll see with the DBQ and with the LEQ, pretty much now all of the questions will begin with the following phrase: evaluate the extent to which. Okay, so let's come up with a question here. What if I said, evaluate the extent to which the American Revolution affected or inspired future revolutions globally? Okay, you then have to answer that argument in your thesis statement, or you have to come up with an argument for that thesis statement to be valid. Okay, when we say evaluate the extent to which, that word extent implies degree. Okay, which means you can have a nuanced argument. So you could have in your thesis, and we often tell you, start off your thesis with a word like although or while, because that sets you up to create an argument. So a valid thesis statement for this question, evaluate the extent to which the American Revolution affected revolutions globally, you might say, while the American Revolution drastically inspired revolutionaries in France and revolutionaries in Latin America, the extent to which the French revolutionaries was inspired was greater than what we saw in Latin America, due to the fact that the ideas which led to the American Revolution were French in their origins. And that would be a valid thesis statement, because essentially what you're saying is the American Revolution greatly inspired the French Revolution, because the French people were frustrated that the Americans took their ideas and ran with them and had a successful revolution, which allowed them to break free from British rule. And here they were still under the thumb of King Louis. Okay, so evaluate the extent allows you to develop an argument, or to develop a nuanced argument. Okay, let's look at the third block, block C. A lot of the DBQ points that you can score come from this section here, known as evidence. The thesis counts for 1 point. The contextualization counts for 1 point. You have 4 evidence points that you are able to earn. Now, just to go back to that first paragraph, you might think, well, if I don't get one of those 2 points, I can still pick up a lot of points elsewhere. In theory, yes. In reality, if you don't have a great first paragraph, if you can't contextualize and create a valid thesis statement, the likelihood of you writing a sound essay the rest of the way is relatively slim. A good solid first paragraph sets you up to be successful throughout the body paragraphs. The first evidence point, and the easiest point to score on the 7-point DBQ, is this first evidence point, where you just have to use the content from at least 3 documents. Okay. Now, I went over how to write the first paragraph. You're not even going to jump into the first paragraph until you have first actually read the documents. Okay. And as you read the documents, you're seeing what they say, which then position you or allow you to come up with an argument. Okay. You don't have to do any sourcing to get this first evidence point. You basically just have to reference 3 documents, which is not difficult to do. When we grade these, and Miss Blizzard and I have graded exams for many years now, probably the most common score is a 1 on a DBQ, and they get this first point. Okay. To go a little bit deeper, to get the second point, you have to go a little bit deeper, where you support the argument. Now, your argument is the argument you put in your thesis statement. You're supporting your thesis by using at least 6 documents. Every DBQ has a total of 7 documents. One of the documents is visual, maybe, or at least one. Normally, the rest of the documents are some written source. Okay. And each of these documents will tell you who the author is, will give you a little bit of information, the date, who the document might be addressing. All of these will then help you with sourcing. The source information will help you with sourcing, which we'll talk about when we get into the analysis and reasoning. Okay. So you then have to use 6 documents in support of the argument in the prompt. Now, when we actually start practicing this, you'll see what this looks like. Is it hard to do? It's not necessarily hard to do. It is time consuming. And since these essays are timed, we sometimes will tell you to sacrifice the second evidence point in order to try to get some of the other points on the rubric. Because if you spend all of this time trying to use 6 or 7 documents and you get the second evidence point, and chances are you might use evidence in response to the prompt 5 times, but the bar is high. You have to do this 6 times. And if you don't get 6, you don't get that point anyway. And then you've wasted all of this time and you didn't get the evidence beyond the document point here, or you didn't get any of these analysis and reasoning points, which we'll look at here in a second. So I like to say, if you can do it, do it. I don't ever want to say don't go after it, but more often than not, if there's a point to leave on the table, it's this point. And truth of the matter is, if you score a 5 or a 6 on the DBQ, on the AP exam, you are going to be well above the national average, which is probably about a 1.7. So let's say you get a 4 on the DBQ. You've still doubled the national average, more than doubled the national average. And you'll be in a fine position to get a 4 or 5 on the exam if you do reasonably well on the SAQ, the multiple choice, and the LEQ. All right. Evidence beyond the documents. Evidence beyond the documents could be, and probably is, a little bit more of a difficult skill to employ, but it won't take you nearly as long as trying to get the second evidence point. So when you use evidence beyond the document, essentially you're using evidence that supports your argument that isn't even contained within the documents. So if you are doing a comparison DBQ on the American Revolution and the French Revolution, and they don't have any document about the Haitian Revolution, there's no mention of Toussaint L'Ouverture, and 10th graders, you're not going to be that familiar with this yet, but the juniors are. You could use L'Ouverture, or you could use uh, his understanding of Enlightenment thought uh, influenced him to lead a successful revolt on that island. And if you're using that in support of the argument and you tie it back to how the American Revolution helped to inspire him, then your reader that grades this essay will say, oh, good, this is EBD, evidence beyond the documents. This kid gets this point. Okay. Evidence beyond the document, I don't think it's terribly difficult, but this is where you have to know the content. And if you're glossing over your reading when it's assigned and you're not picking up on details, you may not miss this. For those of you that are juniors, your A-Push is more detail-oriented than AP World is to begin with. So it should be a little bit easier for you guys to get this point as juniors than maybe it is for the sophomores, because World is a little bit more broad in scope. But I think both groups should be able to make progress in that area as we work throughout the year. The last 2 points available to you on the rubric are in the category of analysis and reasoning. The first point we refer to as sourcing, and there's a little acronym that goes with this known as HIP. The H stands for historical context, and I often like to refer to this as little c so that you don't confuse it with contextualization in block A, which is big C. Okay, so the H is historical context, the I is intended audience, and the 2 P's are purpose and point of view. And so essentially you're using the document, the source information in the document and the contents of it to talk about these 4 things. And you're going to explain, if you go for a point of view analysis, you have to explain why the author of that particular document believed whatever he is espousing or whatever he might think is important. Okay. Purpose. What's the purpose of the document? Why is it being written? You can't just say the purpose of the document was to tell people what he thought. That would not be sufficient. Really get into the why. When you're thinking of analysis, the most important word that you can consider is why. Why? Okay. Who's the intended audience? Why is this audience being written to? What are they trying to be convinced of? Okay. So if you're looking at a document that addresses, let's say, the bourgeoisie in the French Revolution, why would the bourgeoisie, now remember, these are people that have some degree of wealth, they're highly educated, but they're lacking in political power. Okay. So if you have a member of the nobility addressing people from the bourgeoisie, why would a noble be addressing them? What might somebody from the nobility be trying to convince the bourgeoisie of? And so when you start thinking of the reason why a certain group of people or a certain person is being addressed, that will help you with intended audience. Finally, little c, historical context. If you were looking at a document and you wanted to do sourcing for little c, let's say you had a document on the Boston Massacre. If that's a cause, one of the causes of the American Revolution, and you wanted to contextualize the Boston Massacre, you might address some of the tensions that were leading up to that circumstance which took place. Okay. As you read documents together, we'll practice these in class, and we'll look at, what would be the best sourcing to do for this particular document? I always tell my students, whatever emerges for you the quickest, just go with that. Notice you only have to do this 3 times. And if you've been given 7 documents, there's a potential 28 opportunities to source. Some of them will be considerably more obvious than others. You might not be able to find a little c historical context for document number 6. Don't waste time trying to look for a needle in a haystack. You only got to do 3 of these. So if all 3 of them are points of view for document 2, 4, and 7, then you're going to get this point. Now, we always say you should do sourcing for at least 5 documents. In case your attempt fails, then at least you still would have 3. If you only attempt 3 and one of your attempts fails, then you'd only have 2 valid sourcings and you wouldn't get the point. Okay, so we want to make sure that you're doing enough to make up for mistakes. The good thing about all of these essays, you don't get punished for mistakes. You get rewarded for doing something right. So even if you mess up somewhere, you're not losing points, you're just not gaining points, which is a good thing. And the last point, which many of the teachers that teach these 2 classes, they refer to the complex analysis point as the unicorn point. I think around, and Miss Blizzard can correct me if I'm wrong, at least 500,000 students take the AP US exam. World is now up to about 300,000 students, and probably less than 1% of the students that take the exam get the complex analysis point. Hence the name, the unicorn point. You rarely ever see it. What they're looking for is, do you demonstrate a complex understanding of the historical development that is the focus of the prompt, using evidence to corroborate, qualify, or modify an argument that addresses the question? What does all of that mumbo jumbo mean? If you look over in the next box at the 5 bullets, that breaks it down a little bit more easily in a way that's easier to understand. So let's say the target of your prompt, all of these questions will either be a causation question, a comparison question, or a change or continuity over time question. Let's say your question is a causation prompt. If you weave in and out of your causation prompt elements of change over time or continuity over time or similarity or differences, that could open you up to the complex analysis point. Now, most of the time, the documents will be in chronological order. So if you see, as you read these documents, a drastic change over time or something that continues to stay the same time after time again, put that into your essay in an analytical fashion, talking about why that change exists or why that continuity is prevalent over time, and you're potentially going to get this point. But it is very difficult. Let's take the topic we were just talking about, the American Revolution and the French Revolution. If you put something into your essay and you said, we were talking about evaluate the extent to which the American Revolution inspired other revolutions globally. If you go back to some of the revolutionary thinkers in America and you discuss how they had grave concerns about how radical the French Revolution became, if you talk about how a guy like Jefferson was very concerned about the Haitian revolt because it was essentially a slave rebellion, and he himself, among many of the other aristocratic planters who were also slaveholders, believed that was a wrong example of revolution. And you talked some about the contradictions apparent in that thought process, then you're going deeper. You're going into a more analytical aspect. You're looking at different arguments. You're making connections, uh, and you're writing a more analytical and coherent essay. Um, it's quite difficult to do. It is possible, but again, at the end of the day, if you're in the 4-5 range, you are sitting pretty. And so your first essay, a lot of you, the first time you write one of these, even some of you have done this multiple times. Uh, Sometimes the best you do is a 3, and a 3 sounds terrible because 3 out of 7 doesn't even equal 50%. But you can't look at this through that kind of math. Uh, Again, a 4 is just over 50%, but if a 4 doubles the national average, you are sitting pretty. Hopefully, this helps give you a basic understanding of the rubric and what's required to write a valid DBQ. We will practice this much more as the year goes on, and you will get better at it if you work at it. Find out who some of your peers are that do this well and use them as valuable resources in addition to Miss Blizzard, Miss Cespedes, and myself. Take care, and we'll talk soon.